All right, yeah, so I want to talk about publishing data as a blatant act of scholarly communication, somewhere between what we heard from Chris with respect to publishing an article and trying to capture the data behind it, integral with the article, and a data paper where the data themselves are treated as a publication in their own right. There's a middle ground, which I think is a very fruitful place to investigate with respect to this long tail of data. I really liked, Chris, on your slide, you have as the x-axis is intellectual complexity, right? So the farther out on the tail you are, it's rather than calling it small or orphan or some derogatory term, we're talking now about intellectually complex data, not that intellectually simple stuff that's easy to take care of. So with Dryad, the mission is basically to promote the availability of data underlying the findings in the scientific literature for research and educational use, and the particular focus is on that intellectually complex middle ground of data. So how we achieve that mission is to enable researchers to easily archive it, to make it easily discoverable and accessible, to incentivize researchers to strive for greater reuse, empower stakeholders to share governance of an organization, so a repository that's used by many different publishers and journals and societies, and ensure long-term preservation through a sustainable business model, which is not like many of the special repositories that exist in the academic space struggle with those last two bullet items in particular. So just a few points about how it works, and then I'll go on, and I want to speak mostly about sort of the considerations that behind this metaphor of publication with respect to data, which I think is where there's a lot of interesting meat. So the way the Dryad works, imagine your investigator is this author at the top there. They have a manuscript that they wish to submit. There's some data associated with it that maybe the journal policy tells them that they need to archive it at the time of publication. They submit that to a journal, and maybe before peer review or after peer review, depending on how the journal works. They submit the data set down the right-hand stream to Dryad at the same time. There's back channel communication between the journal and the repository so that each are aware of what the state is of the curation or editorial position of the article or the data are, and we can be sure that the identifiers for each are encoded in the records both at the journal and at the repository. When they get published at the same time, they both have their own DOI for the article from Crossref, DOI from the data from DataCite, and they're aware of each other and permanently linked in all the metadata and indexers and so on. So the integration of submission in this way reduces the burden on the author to make sure that this process works in each case, and it's a huge incentive actually to make this a low burden process, to make archiving easy. A lot more uptake of archiving of data when this is just part of the publication process. It's the time when authors have the data in hand that they use for the analysis, and they're willing to jump through a few hoops to get the data in at that point. It's a lot harder to make them jump through any hoops later. So in the end, we get this one mode of publication and one data package, and this is the metaphor that Dryad uses, or the idea behind Dryad, which is not the same as all repositories, but basically one data package in Dryad equals one published article or one book or one thesis. And so we have in Dryad now about 5,500 data packages that correspond to about 5,500 publications out there in the wild. Just to contrast that for a moment with a specialized resource that has a similar relationship between a single article and a single data record, Protein Data Bank is a very widely acknowledged leader in data archiving in the biology space, biomedical space. And here this is intellectually simple data. They're all protein structures. It's actually fairly complicated, but it's easy to say what is going to be in a protein structure record from one protein structure article to the next. And so it's possible to curate these, to ask authors to contribute a lot of the curation, and to develop specialized tools that know what a protein structure record is and what protein structure interested researchers would want to see in a protein structure record. Unlike Dryad, which deals with much more heterogeneous data, and so it's much more difficult to say what a record should look like in any given case. Another illustrative contrast is what I might call a big science data repository. So this is the National Snow and Ice Data Center's DAC, where there may be publications underneath the source of some of these data, but it's lost in the heavy curation and data integration and normalization and the tool building that the data center does. They're interested in the data, in the publications that derive from it and that cite these data resources, but they're less interested in making sure that there's a link to a scholarly record of the sources of the data that's in the repository. And so those are just snapshots of resources at different places along this continuum that I think are illustrative. So here's a snapshot from one page, one day in the life of Dryad, of things that were published on that one day. I'm not sure how easy it is to read, but if one looks at the journals, one can see the kind of diversity that must be supported in the general purpose repository. PLOS One, BMJ Open, a medical journal, development, American Journal of Human Biology, systematic biology, ecological monographs, phytokeys, a taxonomic resource, antimicrobial agents and chemotherapy, et cetera, right? So there's no protein record with a really well-defined structure that could be used for the data sets underlying these articles. So with that preliminary, and how much time have I? Okay, great. I want to take the two sides of the argument. So Dryad is acting in some sense here like a data journal. We're registering the output of scholars and giving them a citable thing, and they can claim priority to it. There's certification that's done in the sense that these are all published articles that have been through peer review, that the data are published for. We don't just take any data that comes our way. It's archived, the way a journal looks after preservation, that it's disseminated through various routes and indexers and so on. There's what we call curation and what a journal would call editing or production, QC, right? There's steps between what the author provides and what the users see. And there's a business model. In our case, we use data publication charges analogously to article processing charges to enable the data to be free for reuse after they're published. So it's relatively small, $60 to $80 compared to an article processing charge for most publishers, but it's basically upfront costing of the long-term preservation and dissemination of those data. Take the counter argument. Dryad is not a journal. It doesn't actually do the peer review itself. It's parasitic on the journals that do. It doesn't provide the context. In fact, the data citation policy that the editors who founded the repository agreed on was that if you're going to cite the data, you need to cite the article as well, because it's almost impossible to understand the data sets in a repository such as this without actually reading the article. And that's, it's a hard one to have cultural take-up on, but you can see the argument for it. The business model is a little different in that although authors can pay DPCs if they have no sponsor when they come to us, the aim is to have all of the submissions sponsored by a publisher or a society or a funder or an institutional library. So there's a little difference there. Obviously, some open access publishers also have sponsorship programs, but they're less common. The heterogeneity that I already discussed. The means of discovery. I would like to see more similarity between finding data and finding the rest of the scholarly literature, but in practice, right now, that's not the case. One goes to different databases to search for data than one does for articles. Thanks. While we provide a DOI, while we have a citation policy for how users should reuse it, it's actually not really that easy to track reuse through citations. We can measure downloads on our site, but the ways that citations can be counted, article level metrics can be counted, don't yet work very well for lots of data resources and for Dryad. And minor differences in licensing, which I don't think I have time to talk about, but not that important. So the other thing I wanted to discuss was the ways that a journal can use a general purpose repository in many different ways depending on their policies. And so we have about 50 journals that have integrated submission with Dryad. There are over 300 for which we have content in the repository. Some of them have integrated submission. Some of them require authors to submit prior to review, some on acceptance, so they intervene at a different place in the workflow. Some of them allow authors to embargo the data in the repository even after the article is out, because cultural acceptance of data archiving is not 100%. Thanks. Some are happy with pre-publication data sharing, as Lori Goodman was talking about, and some want the data to be hidden until the article comes out. Some sponsor it, some don't. Some use Dryad for all supplementary materials and they wouldn't use it otherwise, and some have very strict definitions of what data is appropriate for the repository and they want to host the supplemental materials of other kinds. So in many ways it's very flexible in the way it can support particular publisher or journal policies. A repository such as this that can work flexibly with lots of different input sources like Dryad, like Figshare, as Susanna mentioned, I like to think of as mega repositories. They have the same sort of criterion for scalability that a mega journal does, even if they aren't actually receiving hundreds of thousands of deposits a year. They can potentially do so, right? They can work with an unlimited number of data sources and scale up indefinitely. All right, I will close there. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.